Open up a textbook, and you probably won't find the name Robert F. Williams, even though his story is one of the most fascinating and unusual in American history.
We will enforce our own laws. We will become our own judges, our own juries, and our own executioners.
In the 1950s, Robert F. Williams led the small town of Monroe, North Carolina, in protesting racism and segregation. But his approach to civil rights was unorthodox.
They can depend on us hereafter to meet violence with violence.
He believed, and if you come attack me, I'm going to protect myself.
I'm Anissa Khalifa. This week on The Broadside, my colleague Charlie Shelton Ormand joins me to explore the legacy of Robert F. Williams and how we talk about people who don't neatly fit into dominant narratives of the civil rights movement. Hey, this is Anissa. I just wanted to take a moment to let you know that we can only do what we do with your support. That allows us to bring you original reporting every week about the stories that matter to you, about our home, this fascinating place that we live in. To support the show, go to this week's episode description and click the link, or go to WUNC.org and click on the donate link in the upper right-hand corner. Thank you so much, and now let's get back to the show. Hey, Charlie.
Hey, how are you?
Doing good. Ready for this history lesson.
Let's do it.
So, Charlie, Robert F. Williams, who was he?
Well, the one-sentence answer is Robert Williams was a civil rights leader in Monroe, North Carolina in the 1950s.
And why do you want to talk about him today?
Number one, his story is just fascinating. The ways he challenged segregation in a small southern town really caught my attention. And number two, I think that his story challenges us today to rethink how we look at the civil rights movement overall.
Okay. And just placing Monroe on the map, it's a town about 30 miles southeast of Charlotte.
That's right. And back in the 1950s, like a lot of towns in the Jim Crow South, it was steeped in segregation.
Demonstrations in Monroe started early. In fact, we had demonstrations before the whole sit-in movement had started.
That's Robert Williams, speaking in 1985. In the late 50s, he was constantly disrupting a segregated status quo in town. He was the president of the local NAACP chapter at the time.
And what was the atmosphere in Monroe at the time?
Well, the town's segregated swimming pool was a flashpoint for several protests.
Sometimes when we appeared on the scene, that all the white swimmers would jump out of the pool and would start to run. So as a result, we kept them from doing business. And finally, they just closed the pool.
Robert Williams also recalled unfair treatment from the police and dangerous run-ins with the KKK.
The Klansmen started to move in, and they had had mass rallies where newspapers reported that they had had as many as 7,500 people in fields for these mass rallies, and they were beginning to attack us.
Okay, where are we going to start?
To start, let's go back to the late 1950s, 1959 specifically.
Why do you want to start there?
That's when the town was wrapped up in a tense court case. A white man had been charged with beating and attempting to rape a black woman. Here's Robert Williams talking about the trial.
And the defense attorney turned to the judge and said, "Judge, Your Honor, Mr. Mellon is not guilty of any crime. He was just drinking and having a little fun." Said, "You see this woman here, his wife? This is God's lovely creature and God's greatest gift to man, the pure flower of life, this white woman. And do you think that he would leave God's greatest gift to man for that?" Talking about the black woman. And made it appear that the black woman was really on trial.
So Robert Williams is talking about some really ugly race baiting there from the attorney.
And ultimately, the white man on trial was acquitted. And it was a gut punch to black folks in Monroe who were keeping up with the case.
So the black women turned to me in the courtroom and they said, "Now, if it hadn't been for you, these men would have been punished. And now you've opened the floodgates on us, that they feel now they can do anything to us with impunity."
So what does he mean when he says that the women told him, "If it hadn't been for you"?
Essentially, they were calling him out for kicking a hornet's nest. If he hadn't upset the powers that be with all the protests, this wouldn't have happened. But this acquittal really was a tipping point for lots of people in Monroe, including Robert Williams, who felt that enough was enough.
So they said, well, what are you going to say now? And so I turned to them and I said, from this day forward, we will meet violence with violence.
Meet violence with violence. I can imagine that's going to raise some eyebrows. It's a big statement coming from Monroe's NAACP president.
Definitely. That alone will cause some attention. But there's another big piece to this that adds weight to Robert Williams' declaration here. Along with the NAACP, he actually led another group, a local charter of the NRA.
Oh, wow.
We organized a rifle club and got a charter through the American Rifle Association.
That's Mabel Williams, Robert Williams' wife. This is her in 1999, talking with a historian with the Southern Oral History Program.
We practiced shooting. We were all members. I was a member as well.
Now, Robert Williams had served in the military as a Marine.
So he knew his way around a firearm.
Yeah, and he brought other black veterans into this group to help teach folks how to use their guns. He called the group the Black Armed Guard.
We got our charter. We'd have our little meetings. And that was the backbone of our defense group.
Backbone of their defense group.
Yeah, that's definitely important to emphasize. Their stance was rooted in what Robert Williams called, quote, armed self-reliance. Here's Mabel Williams again.
He was the ultimate teacher, always. And he always taught the other people and us that a gun is a weapon that can do terrible damage to people. And the only reason you would ever pick up a gun is for self-defense.
So hearing Robert and Mabel Williams, it really makes me think of the overlaps with the Black Panther Party and the Black Power movement in the 60s and 70s.
Definitely. But Robert Williams was casting out this message in the late 50s, years before the Black Power movement really got going on a national stage.
So a forebear to that cause in a way.
Right.
But this is the 1950s, and he gets the green light to start an NRA chapter.
Yeah.
I mean, we have the Second Amendment, but I can't imagine the people in charge would be thrilled to allow a black man into their ranks.
Yeah, well, not if they don't know about it. When he applied for the charter, he didn't put down that he was black.
I'm sure when we joined and the years after then, had they known we were a black group, they would have revoked our charter. I'm sure they would have.
So how then did this statement go over in 1959 when Robert Williams talked about meeting violence with violence?
Not too well. Just hours after he said it, Robert Williams got a message from Roy Wilkins at the NAACP head office. It was to inform Williams that unless he apologized, he'd be suspended as president of the local chapter.
And I told him that I would only go on any television, any place else to apologize to white people after they had apologized to us first for what they had done to us in this country.
But Robert Williams continued to fight for civil rights in North Carolina, and people still looked to him for leadership, even after he was ousted from his role as president.
Meanwhile, we're getting into the early 60s, and protests are ramping up all across the South. How'd that play out in Monroe?
Yeah, the summer of 1961 was a pivotal time for the town. There were more heated incidents at the segregated swimming pool, and in August that year, a group of freedom riders came into town to protest segregation.
So they were here. They were a mix of white and black.
This is Robert Heath. He grew up in Monroe and lives there today. I met up with him last summer to chat more about being a teenager there in the 50s and 60s. He and I met at the town square, where clashes between protesters and counter-protesters went down.
And one of the freedom riders was thrown off the steps right here.
Right here in front of the courthouse.
Right in front of the courthouse.
Protests continued in town for a couple weeks, and once again, it put Monroe in the national spotlight.
Let me take you to a corner of this world that we call free. It's Monroe, North Carolina, where the Klan rules by decree.
This is Pete Seeger, a couple years later in 1963. The song is called The Ballad of Old Monroe.
18 freedom riders came in August 61 at the call of young Rob Williams to see what could be done. Robert Williams.
And how involved was Robert Williams in all of this?
He wasn't really a part of the crowd protesting. With Monroe feeling more and more like a powder keg, he knew that there was a target on his back.
And it was a very serious situation at that time for Rob.
But despite his goal to lay low, Robert Williams couldn't avoid attracting some unwanted attention one particular night, one that would end up shaping the rest of his life.
According to Mrs. Stegall, she and her husband drove to Monroe Sunday afternoon to visit her mother. They heard of the disturbances in town but weren't involved until they took a shortcut to their destination.
When protests in downtown Monroe were at their peak, a white couple named the Steagles drove through a predominantly black neighborhood in town. It was where Robert and Mabel Williams lived.
Then on Winchester Street, passing through a Negro neighborhood, a crowd suddenly blocked their path.
And so I could tell that the crowd was becoming too tense. And I got into the crowd around the Steagles, and I started pushing the crowd away from them.
Robert Williams says he offered the Steagles a place to stay in the neighborhood while things cooled off. After a few hours, they went about their way, safely driving out of the neighborhood. But later that evening, Robert Williams learned there was an order out for his arrest.
They said to me that, Robert, you caused a lot of trouble in this town, and now state troopers are on the way, and in 30 minutes you'll be hanging in the courthouse square.
So, what were the charges?
Authorities wanted to charge him and several others for kidnapping the white couple.
Which, considering everything else going on, sounds a little suspicious.
Yeah, Robert Williams was adamant that the authorities were using the Steagles as a setup to have him arrested.
So I told my wife that we were going to have to leave.
When we come back, the Williams family looks for safety in the one place they knew they couldn't be arrested. That's after a short break.
AI chatbots parse information. Have you ever considered their romantic potential? In a new 3-part series on love and AI from Embodied, we'll explore the intricacies of human-bot relationships, learn about the past, present, and future of sex robots, and meet people uploading conversations with their loved ones into software in hopes that it can help them grieve. New episodes drop each Friday in February, starting on the 9th. Subscribe and follow Embodied so you don't miss it.
We're back with the broadside. Okay, Charlie, so we left Robert and Mabel Williams with the authorities hot on their trail. So where did they escape to?
Okay, real quick, just remember that this is in August of 1961. The Cold War has gotten intense. But despite that, the Williams flee the U.S. and seek refuge in Cuba.
Cuba? How'd they swing that?
So Robert Williams had actually traveled to Cuba before and had a good relationship with its government. And once he came back with his family in 1961, he didn't go off the map and try to disappear. Just the opposite.
From Havana, Cuba, free territory of the Americas, Radio Free Dixie invites you to listen to the free voice of the South. Stay with us for music, news, and commentary by Robert F. Williams.
Let our people take to the streets in fierce numbers, meet violence with violence, and let our battle cry be heard around the world. Freedom, freedom, freedom now or death.
Robert Williams hosted a radio show that could be heard in parts of the U.S., letting people know he was still out there broadcasting his opinions. And remember, this is the early 60s. The Cuban Missile Crisis happened during this period, so anything connected to Cuba is going to be contentious.
So did they settle down in Cuba for a while?
Just for a few years. Then they headed over to the People's Republic of China.
From one communist government to another.
And then eventually, at the end of the 60s, Robert Williams was able to safely come back to the United States. He worked it out with the U.S. government to return in exchange for his knowledge about China.
Back to North Carolina?
No, not back to North Carolina. Things weren't safe enough to return there. So the Williams family settled in Michigan. And in the mid-70s, the U.S. government officially dropped all the charges against him.
From the time I married him until the time that we returned from China, I believe that he had a basic belief that there had to be good people in this government that were going to stand up for what was right.
Robert Williams continued to live in Michigan until his death in 1996. His funeral took place in Monroe, where he's buried. Among those in attendance was Rosa Parks, who gave a eulogy sharing her admiration for the man. And 10 years ago, in 2014, Mabel Williams was laid to rest right next to her husband.
He always wanted to stand up for the right thing, and he felt like other people were joining good people.
Charlie, we talked at the beginning about how Robert F. Williams isn't in many history books. What about people in Monroe? Do they know about him?
He's definitely not a household name, but people in town are starting to know about him more and more.
They say freedom is a constant struggle.
Ooh, who is that singing?
That's Mary D. Williams. She's a gospel singer and historian here in North Carolina.
Mary D. Williams. Any relation to Robert Williams?
No relation. But she is one of several historians in the area who are spreading the word about Robert Williams, educating folks about this history. And when she starts singing, it can stop you right in your tracks. This was at a community event in Monroe at the end of last summer, recognizing Robert F. Williams.
Listening to Mary D. Williams sing, it makes me think about the different ways that we interact with these kinds of histories.
Absolutely, yeah. There isn't a one-size-fits-all method for sharing a story, right?
Especially for a topic like the civil rights movement.
With that, we should shout out historian Tim Tyson. He's written a lot of great things on Robert F. Williams over the years, including a biography. He says Robert Williams challenges the narrative of our, quote, cinematic civil rights movement.
Oh, I love that phrase.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, he's talking about this idealized version of the movement, right? One that primarily praises successful campaigns of nonviolence.
And Robert F. Williams doesn't really gel into that cinematic ideal. So where does he fit?
Yeah. And what changes when we bring him back into the narrative? So going to an event like this, hearing Mary D. Williams perform, it's going to give you a kind of education that's really different from reading about somebody in a textbook. And often the people who were there and lived it will tell you things that aren't in the books.
Yeah, that's where people like Robert Heath come in. He gives historical tours of Monroe in his spare time. I was actually able to get a VIP tour with him last summer.
Yeah, let's go. This is my car right here.
Okay, great.
Okay.
I'll climb in the passenger seat then.
Okay. So this is the street they came on. This is where the couple claimed they got lost. The white couple got caught. Now, Rob House is torn down.
Now, Robert Heath is all about spotlighting local stories. But he says what we call capital H history can be really dependent on who is telling it.
Write a new book and call it Our Story. Forget the word history. Our story, you don't know because you don't have them back there.
Yeah, I can imagine Robert Heath's tour around Monroe is going to be really different from anybody else's.
Definitely. He's got specific spots he wants to show people as part of the town's story. Like I said earlier, he was a teenager in Monroe when all the protests were ramping up in the 50s and 60s.
Putting Green is right there?
Yeah.
That was the swimming pool.
Okay.
There's a lot of pictures in the library we're going to about that.
Speaking of which, Anissa, do you want to go to the library next?
You know I'm a library kid. I always want to go to the library.
How's it going?
I'm Patricia Poland.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet
Thanks
you
so much
too.
for taking the time this afternoon.
Have
I
y'all
really appreciate
signed
it.
in?
After our tour around town, Robert Heath introduced me to Patricia Poland. She's the retired local history librarian at the Union County Library.
It is a job that I sort of fell into, and I feel very blessed that I did. My role now is people keep asking me questions.
Patricia is steeped in Monroe's history. We met in a room full of local artifacts and documents and talked for a long time about the town and Robert Williams. And she said something off the bat about him that caught my attention.
Now, when I first started working in here, which would have been part-time in 2003, I wouldn't have touched Robert Williams with a 10-foot pole.
Oh, interesting. Why is that?
As a white woman, she says she felt a little out of her depth. She recalled an early conversation with a supervisor about the protests in 1961.
I said, gosh, if my grandmother had lived here, I said, I can imagine, and in town, I can imagine how terrified she would have been. And she looked at me. She goes, why? And I said, because of the riot. And she said, don't talk about things you don't know anything about.
So what changed her perspective?
She says it happened gradually as more people came into the library asking for stuff on Robert Williams. It stirred an interest for her to spend more time learning about him, and a recognition that
you never learn everything. That's one of the first things you have to accept, too. There will always be something new to learn. Somebody else will always know something that you never knew. And that was kind of what I started leading towards.
So Patricia is helping people, like Robert Heath, educate folks in Monroe about their shared local history. But what about those on the receiving end of this? How has Patricia seen people in Monroe respond to Robert Williams' story?
Yeah, that's a good question. Here's what she had to say about that.
If you mentioned his name to, and I'm just going to say it, a white person who had been here, a funny look would get on their face. No, nobody liked him. He was terrible. But I think as time has gone on, it's shown that what I used to say was he did what he had to do. Change was coming. If he didn't do it, eventually someone else would have. But, what would our town have been like if there had been no Robert Williams?
Would you say, from your experience as a historian, that we like to fit our historical figures neatly into these narratives that we create for them?
We do, especially when there are heroes. Yes, I believe we decide what we want to know, and we make up our mind about the story or the narrative, and many people flat won't budge. Even if you showed them proof, they won't accept it. This is how it is. This is what I was told. I'm not going to believe you.
And sometimes stories get mixed up. I tell people we can listen to someone and go back and write two different things we just heard.
You need to listen to many voices in order to get the full story. But you put all those stories together to get a better picture of what happened. And it's up to all of us. All of us have a part in our community's history. It's a collective experience, and it shouldn't be ignored.
So we've chatted about the different ways to tap into this history. A tour around town, old artifacts in a library, a special concert. Last, but certainly not least, oral histories.
Right.
But I keep thinking that those are all things that somebody would have to seek out if they were interested in learning more about Robert Williams.
That's right. That's a good point. And with that, there's actually one more thing that I want to tell you about. Back to last summer. After the event with Mary D. Williams had wrapped up, a group of folks ventured outside in the middle of a hot and humid August afternoon. On the side of a highway with cars rolling by, they unveiled a new historical marker for Robert Williams.
Robert!
This marker is a big deal for Monroe. It's the town's first public recognition of Robert Williams as an influential civil rights leader.
Remembering the past so that we can honor, learn, and build in our present and our future. Lord, I remember...
Making it happen took diligence from folks like Patricia Poland and Robert Heath. They worked with the state government to get it approved, along with Monroe native and Durham high school teacher Ormand.
My father, who wanted to be here today, but he passed this summer, but he and I talked a lot about it in his last weeks, actually. You know, this is not the part of Monroe where I'm from, but my dad always told me about this history that a lot of other people didn't know, and to participate in this and see this side of my county that I never knew growing up has been a beautiful thing that I'm thankful for.
So with this highway marker, somebody could in theory be passing by and stop to learn more about this person that they otherwise hadn't heard of before.
Yeah, the highway it's on is busy, so you have to really slow down to check it out. But even if you miss it driving by, just the fact that it's there is evidence of how far Robert Williams' story has come in Monroe. Before I melted from the heat, I was able to catch up with Robert Heath one more time.
I just hope people read more about this history to our younger folks. If they do that, I'll be happy. And the name still has that villain and hero. Maybe it's leveled off now. The evil is now.
Charlie, we've been talking about Robert F. Williams, but this conversation really just scratches the surface of a much bigger part of American history. There are so many of these stories about where we live that A, we don't know, and B, don't fit neatly into our mainstream narrative.
Absolutely. There's a lot we did not get to in this. And I feel like Robert Heath said it best right then, encouraging folks to use this as a kind of springboard, right, to read more about Robert Williams. And in general, just about civil rights history in these small towns across the South, because, like you said, it is definitely there.
This was great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Anissa.
Of course. This episode of The Broadside was produced by Charlie Shelton Ormand. Our editor is Jared Walker. Our executive producer is Wilson Sayer. Special thanks to the Julian Edison Department of Special Collections at Washington University Libraries. Also thanks to the Southern Oral History Program at UNC-Chapel Hill, Smithsonian Folkways Recordings, and WBTV in Charlotte. The Broadside is a production of WUNC North Carolina Public Radio. You can email us at broadside@wunc.org. If you enjoyed the show, leave us a rating, a review, or share it with a friend. Thanks for listening, y'all. We'll be back next week.